Hey everybody, I have my game from Wednesday for you. It was the first round of the Martin Laine Memorial up at the Wachusett Chess Club, and I was on board one against Mike Commisso, rated a bit over 1660. And you might notice that I have a little bit of a different setup this week. Mike was nice enough to send me his notes on the game, and I'm displaying them here in the super high-tech notepad window to your left. So we'll go over those as we look at the game. Alright, I had the white pieces. Oh, you know what? I think I realized this is not going to work. Because the notepad window is going to go behind the other window. Yeah, whatever. D4, D5. I played C4 and Mike played knight C6, which is what he played last time. It is the Chigorin defense. And I don't remember what I played against him the last time, but this time I chose to go with knight C3, and he played E5. There are options here for white. I didn't feel like taking on E5 though, because black can play D4, which unlike in the Albin counter gambit, hits a knight on C3, and so is played with tempo. So I took on D5 instead. And let's go back to Mike's notes for a sec and get into them a little bit. He says, "Hi Brett, here are my thoughts about our game Wednesday. I felt I played less well than last time. On reflection, I still think so, but not as much as I thought right afterward. The opening was comparable, but I achieved almost no initiative, so you had a serious bind, and there were less imbalances, which were in your favor due to a large space advantage and freedom of movement. I think you played better in this game than last time to limit my chances and convert it to an easy endgame." Okay, so he saw the game as happening in 5 phases. He said on 1d4, my first goal was to not yield a central pawn mass and a bind. I mishandled this again, and your knight-kicking tempos resulted in your strong center. On d5, I think he means c takes d5, I considered e takes d, but decided that you could trade queens and win the pawn takes next piece race. I think it was probably a better approach than allowing the bind. At least there would be space. So what he's saying is he thought here about playing e takes d4, but he thought that after d takes c6, d takes c3, queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, c takes b7. If he plays c takes b2, of course I get a queen before he does. In fact, I can just win a piece with b takes c8 equals queen check. But I was concerned in this variation about black playing bishop to b4, I think it was. And bishop takes b7, by the way. So let's look at that first. After bishop takes b7, I think white wins a pawn, but black gets a little bit of activity in exchange for it, although I'll admit that this looked like more activity to me when I was visualizing it than it does now on the board. And maybe black can play bishop to b4, which threatens c takes b2 check, which creates another queen on a1. So something like, not something like, specifically b takes a8 equals queen allows black to play c takes b2 check, and then make a queen himself. For example, king d1, and then a queen is created. Though with white moving first here, I wouldn't be surprised if he's better. Anyway, this looked kind of complicated to me, and I wasn't exactly sure who it was going to favor. But Mike chose not to go down this line, and thinks in hindsight that he should have. He played knight takes d4 here instead. And when I looked in an opening database after the game, I was once again surprised to find that this is a position that has occurred many times in master games. It looked to me to be bad for black, and that's because of the move e3, which I played, which forces the knight back to this awkward f5 square. On top of that, at some point the pawn's going to come to e4, again moving with tempo, probably once I have something covering d4 so that the knight can't just hop back in there. And white's going to have a lot of central space, and a mobile pawn on d5, which might cause black a lot of problems. I played knight to f3, targeting the e5 pawn and leaving black with an uncomfortable couple of options. One is to play f6 to defend e5, but that move is notorious for weakening the black king. And the other is to do what Mike did, which is bishop to d6, which develops a piece, but once the bishop's on d6, the knight on f5 has lost its most desirable square. So I played e4, having covered d4, and this knight now has to retreat to either e7 or h6. If it had gone to h6, then as soon as black developed his kingside knight, I probably would have taken on h6, destroying the black kingside pawn structure and leaving the black king without a middle game haven. So Mike went back to e7 instead, which I think was correct. And as I said earlier, the situation now is that white has significantly more space, and I thought during the game that this was a much better position for me. I played bishop to b5 check, basically just trying to get a piece out with tempo so that I could castle. Mike played bishop to d7. I think c6 was probably not so hot here, because after d takes c6, there are a couple issues for black. One is that the recapture isn't good either way. Knight takes c6. Oh, I mean, maybe it's acceptable, but knight takes c6 kind of justifies the bishop's position on b5. And b takes c6 leaves black having to defend multiple weaknesses. So Mike played bishop d7 instead, which I think was a good idea, and I castled kingside. I haven't said this in, God, probably 10 videos, so I should probably say it again. Castle kingside probably averages being the best move in the game of chess. In the positions in which it's legal, it's evaluated by a computer as the best move or the second best move almost every time. So it's hard to go wrong with that move. I expected that Mike would trade on b5 here, and after knight takes b5, continue developing. And I thought, well, actually, maybe he can play a6 here. No, he doesn't need to. What am I talking about? So knight f6, and I'd probably be trading my knight for his bishop on d6, which would leave me with a bishop for knight, but I wasn't exactly satisfied with this outcome, because I thought I should have more after being significantly better in the opening. But Mike didn't take on b5. He played knight f6 right away. And this has a bit of a threat, which is to take on b5, and after I recapture, to grab my e4 pawn. And if we go back to Mike's notes for a sec, he says that, as far as he was concerned, the second phase of the game was after bishop to b4 check, but I think he means bishop to b5 check. He says, I judged there were two paths the game could take, one with you developing your queen's bishop to my king's side, possibly enticing h6 or f6. So I think he means, whoops, bishop g5, and eventually landing on g3 to exert a lot of pressure on e5. So he saw my bishop coming back this way and targeting that weakness on e5. I saw less chance to hold that position, so I went with the other approach of fighting the center and king's bishop with c6. I liked the counterattacking nature of it, but don't know if b takes c is the right follow-up. Probably bishop takes c6 is good because it anchors the bishop on the b7 pawn or forces a trade of bishops. If there is no trade, I have two pieces on each four, which would be the ultimate result. Okay, so the way the game went was queen b3. I thought he made a comment about that somewhere. Yeah, down here in the third section, when he's talking about rook b8. He says he judged that the typical mechanical. Queen a5 would either liquidate or let me gain some queenside space, and then queen b3 is much better. I think he's talking about this position and about white's move queen a4, which doesn't really threaten anything. Black, I think, can castle kingside here, and I'm not sure what white has on the queen side other than trading off a couple of pieces. Black might also be able to play a6 here when this doesn't look like much of anything to me, especially because the knight has lost the b5 square. I played queen b3 instead, with the idea that I was stopping black's threat. Now bishop takes b5 is met with queen takes b5, check, and generating one of my own, because in that position I'd be forking the king and the b7 pawn. And to be honest, I'm not sure I would have been interested in taking that pawn in all variations, but it was at least something to make Mike think about. He played c6. Okay, so this is where he was talking about liking the counterattacking nature of the move. I took on c6, and he took back with his b pawn. And he says in his notes that he's not sure that b takes c6 was the right follow-up. He thinks probably bishop takes c6 was better. Yeah, it's difficult to choose here with black because b takes c6 comes with tempo and prepares another tempo move in rook b8. But it creates another weakness in the black camp. A couple weaknesses, because these two pawns, these two black pawns now on the A and B files, will not be neighbors anymore. Mike played b takes c6 though, and I saw an opportunity to insert an in-between move in knight g5, so I did, threatening queen takes f7, checkmate. Mike castled, and then I retreated my bishop to c4, renewing a threat on f7. And now I think rook b8 doesn't work because of knight takes f7. Actually, bishop takes f7 might be fine too. But several times during the game I think rook b8 would have allowed knight takes f7 when rook takes b3 is met with knight takes d6 check. I'm sorry, this is not the position because the queen on d8 is not under attack by the knight like it is later in the game. So back here I guess I would have played bishop takes f7 when black can't play rook takes f7, and then maybe I would have... Yeah, then maybe after king h8 I would have played queen d1, hitting this bishop on d6. So he played queen e8 instead, guarding f7. And now we'll see those variations in which rook b8 I don't think quite works out because of knight takes f7 and knight takes d6. I played rook d1, eyeing these minor pieces on the d file. Why not? Develops a piece and generates a threat. And Mike played knight to c8, which surprised me quite a bit. I expected the bishop to come to c5 and put some pressure on f2. And I don't think there would have been any tactics having to do with f7 there because the knight from f6 is guarding the otherwise undefended bishop on d7. But Mike played knight to c8. I played bishop to, e3. I could have played bishop d2 here right away with the idea to stick the bishop on e1 so that the other rook can be activated. But I didn't even really consider it, and I think it's because I made some kind of subconscious value judgment that bishop on e3, encouraging black's knight to come to g4, is better because that will cost black some of the defense of his minor pieces on the d file. Mike did play knight g4. I played bishop to d2, and he played bishop to c5, putting a second attacker on f2. After bishop to e1, this bishop's kind of passive, but at least it's not on the c1 square anymore. And I was happy that the black knight was no longer guarding the bishop on d7. Alright, but we got here, and Mike played a move that for some reason I didn't even consider, and that looks like the best move to me, and that's knight d6. He would like simply to grab the bishop on c4, which is a very nice piece, and at that point I won't be threatening anything on f7, and he can simply kick my knight away. And I can't even any longer take on f7 as a way to maybe trade a couple of my pieces for a rook and a pawn, because the knight's guarding that square. So I got a little bit worried here, but then realized that there might be a nice exchange sacrifice in rook takes d6. And that's what I played. Let's go back to Mike's notes for a second to see if he talks about this. Okay, I played c takes b. I think b takes c6 to restrict the knight's movement on c3 and to open the b file. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not sure what he means by the game result was given on rook takes c6, but I felt that the queenside looseness was a better approach than symmetry. Maybe there wasn't rook takes c6. He might be talking about the endgame there, or he might have meant some piece other than a rook. Okay, rook b8 was the next thing he was thinking about, and this is when he made the comment about queen a5 and queen b3. But he said he considered rook b8 right away, given that his pawn on e5 prevents me from having a London-style bishop on f4, I think. But he said he wanted to wait until a tempo on my queen might give him counterplay, and he shouldn't have waited. Yeah, I agree with that last part. If there was an opportunity to get in rook b8, then black absolutely should have played it, because this queen is too powerful on b3. Knight to d6, and I sacrificed an exchange on d6. He took back, and then I activated my last piece with rook d1. And I thought I had calculated pretty well here that the bishop's undefended and can't be defended by anything that's not also responsible for defending f7. So it would have to be moved again. Mike played bishop c5, which I think is the best move. But I missed something here, which is that in my knight takes f7 line, things aren't quite as simple as they seem. I was looking at knight takes f7, rook takes f7, bishop takes f7 check, queen takes f7, queen takes f7 check, king takes f7, rook takes d7 check. When white has entered an endgame up a pawn with the same pieces, and so no imbalance in that regard, and a clearly superior rook. But I realized once we got to this position that after knight takes f7, black might be able to do this, knight takes f2. He might be able to give up a piece on the f2 square, bishop takes f2 check, king takes f2, and somehow make use of this absolute pin along the f-file. Now I couldn't see how he would do that, but it just made me uncomfortable enough that I decided to play another variation if I could find one. In hindsight, now seeing this on the board instead of thinking about it in my mind, again, it doesn't look so bad. But I was afraid of it during the game. So I went for bishop takes f7 check instead, and black is compelled to take the bishop to avoid losing the queen, so he played rook takes f7. And here knight takes f7 again is not so hot, or at least it's definitely not so hot this time, because of bishop to e6 with a fork. So I played queen takes f7 check, and here again a trade is forced because king h8 would drop the bishop on d7. So Mike did that, he took my queen on f7, I took back, and here finally black has an option, and I think Mike picked the wrong one. If I were black, I would save this bishop on d7. White has emerged from the complications up a pawn, 6 to 5. But black, as a little bit of compensation, has the two bishops. And if he allows the two bishops to be gotten rid of without getting his pawn back, then he's just going to be equal across the board except in material. And that's going to cause white to have an easy position to play. Mike played king takes f7, which I don't like for that reason, because after rook takes d7 check, white and black have the same pieces, but white's rook is much more active than black's, and white is up a pawn, and white has 3 targets in the center and on the queen side to attack, which might cause him to be up 2 pawns. Instead, I was looking during the game at bishop to e6, which I thought I was going to respond to with knight g5, and then I thought black would play bishop c4. And I'm not claiming that this is a holdable position for black, but just that holding on to the 2 bishops is a better practical try than allowing there to be no imbalance except material. Or I should say no imbalance except those imbalances which favor white. As I said, he played king takes f7, I played rook takes d7 check, he played king g6. And now maybe is a good time to go back to Mike's notes to see if we find anything that has to do with these last few moves. Okay, here he says knight g5 had the intended effect of your queen's bishop reversing course, but I needed to backtrack with knight f6 to later cover my queen's bishop. I think he means knight g4, hitting my bishop on e3 and forcing it back to d2. But he needed to go back to f6 later on to defend his bishop. Yeah, so maybe even in this position, knight to f6 was reasonable. It covers the bishop on d7, and black is still looking at taking this knight, so that knight would have to move away, although actually it just grabs the pawn on e5 here. Okay, so not here, but in some other position, Mike maybe could have retreated his knight to f6 to guard the bishop on d7. Back to his notes. I missed the rook pressure on 2 bishops after the exchange sack, which I did expect. Yeah, so Mike saw more deeply here than I did. I didn't even see his knight d6 move, and so I wasn't even looking at the exchange sacrifice. He says that after bishop d2 is when he should have played rook b8. Let's see. Let's head back there. Okay, so after I played bishop e3, he played knight g4, my bishop went back to d2, and he's saying here was an opportunity to play rook b8. And yeah, I think that's probably true. In order to create an imbalance, I might have played bishop takes f7 check here. Not bishop takes, knight takes f7. When rook takes b3, I don't think is good for black because of knight takes d6 check, king h8, knight takes e8, when things don't look like they're working out for black. So he would have had to take on f7 with the rook, and then I could have taken with my bishop. He'd have recaptured. Then I was thinking about just moving the queen away somewhere here, c2, or I don't know if a4 is an option. And continuing the game from there with an interesting imbalance. And I thought, well, maybe my rook for 2 minors is better here than it would be otherwise because of the targets on the d-file. But yeah, rook b8 probably should have been played here. Let's see what else he says. In that position, liquidating on f7 is similar, but I now have rook takes b2 available and some possible initiative, at least more than such a purely defensive approach. Yeah, you definitely want counterplay. I saw knight d6 leading to the exchange sack as better than knight b6 because it also covered f7. I think rook b8 would have helped there too. Okay, so he thinks rook b8 maybe instead of knight d6. Maybe he means after, because if rook b8 here can be responded to with queen takes b8, so maybe he means knight to b6 followed by rook b8. This guards the bishop on d7. Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, I could play bishop takes f7 check, rook takes f7. Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything here, so that looks reasonable. And the rest of his comments are about the endgame, so let's head there. As I said before, sacked an exchange on d6 and played rook d1, and then went for these tactics. I think Mike should have retained the two bishops, but he didn't. I played rook takes d7 check, he played king g6. And now white looks to be winning a pawn with rook c7, but I was worried that playing it immediately would allow rook to f8 with an unnecessary amount of pressure on f2, which would probably force me to put my knight back on d1. I guess I can take on c6 with check here instead and win the bishop on c5. So never mind that. I should have just played rook c7 right away. But instead, I thought I should play h3 and scare the knight away back to f6, and then play rook c7 and win the pawn. Mike played rook to b8, threatening b2, but not really, because rook takes c6 threatens the bishop on c5. White's up 2 pawns now, has a pawn majority on both sides of the board, has a better rook, and so is clearly winning. Mike, of course, was right to play on, though. He played bishop to d4. I played b3, saving the pawn. He played rook to b7. I think if I were black, I would have played king f7 right away, because now that the knight is not pinned, perhaps black is threatening bishop takes c3 and knight takes e4. Not really, because white would probably have bishop takes e5 after that, but at least black is trying to generate threats here. Mike played rook b7 instead, but that allows me to play king f1, and now after his king f7 I can just play f3 to defend e4. He went knight to d7. Yeah, he has to try something, but the problem with this move is that my knight will now land on d5. Bishop to f2, offering a trade of pieces. Why not? I'm up 2 pawns. g6 from Mike, and now knight d5. And things are getting worse because now the white rook is better than the black rook, and the white knight is better than the black knight. Mike played bishop back to b6. I could have taken here with my knight, but I thought if I'm up 2 pawns, why create any kind of imbalance? I might as well just trade piece for piece. So I played bishop takes b6, he played a takes b6, another rook on b8, on b7 is very passive. King to e2, rook to a7, threatening to take here with check. So I played a4, he played his rook back to b7, and I played b4 to cover the c5 square. g5 from Mike, I mean, it's not a good move, but black doesn't have any good moves here. I played rook h6 to attack this now vulnerable h7 pawn. Mike played king g7, and I moved my rook back to d6. And after king f7, white's rook has moved from c6 to d6, and it's white's move again. And when I see opportunities like that in chess, I often take advantage of them. Opportunities to gain a move, even if it's only a very small improvement. I played king d3, and in light of the fact that his pieces are passive and he's down 2 pawns and there isn't a way to stop king c4 to b5 to c6, Mike resigned here. Let's take a look at the rest of his notes. He says, number 5, a zugzwang-filled endgame that was easy for white to play. Not much to say there, except I wished I had knight f6 earlier, but given the 2-to-1 on the queen side, the tempo probably wouldn't have been worth enough. Not sure which tempo he means, but yeah, it's definitely a really tough endgame for black, especially once we're in this position with the white pieces being more active. So, a good game. Mike tried the Chigorin against me again. We'll see if he does that again the next time. And in his defense, as he mentioned, he always has black against me. He never seems to get white. So the colors haven't exactly been fair so far. Thank you for watching, and I will be back next week with the next game.